the Bible trying to find great examples of numerous good examples of fathers. But if you do, you might be surprised at what you find. I want to tell you a couple of stories about fathers in the Bible, different ones, kind of different things that they went through, but I'm not going to give out the name in which they apply, and maybe we'll test your Bible knowledge a little bit and see if you know who I'm talking about. There was a time whenever Israel was under oppression by the Midians, and they were causing them great grief and struggles. And the angel of the Lord appeared to a young man, and he says, I want you to lead my people out of this oppression and defeat the Midianites. And one of the things that he was asked to do was he was asked to take his father's altar of Baal and tear it down, and the Asherah pole that was beside it, tear it down, pull it down as well, build an altar there, take one of his father's bulls and another bull, I presume of his father's, and offer them on that sacrifice on the altar that he had just built, using the Asherah. Asherah was like a totem pole, wooden totem pole, and take that and use it as wood to build a fire with. And he was so scared to do it and so fearful because of the way that people were in that time that he took 10 men, 10 servants, and he went and did it at night. The next morning, whenever the townspeople woke up and realized that their altar of Baal was torn down, the Asherah was torn down, that the wood had been used as firewood, and Dad's bull was missing, as well as another one, the people all came together and says, who did this? They must pay for it with their life. Joash was the father, and Joash stepped in just as they found out who the guilty party was, and says, if your God that you serve, if our God, he was the servant of this same God, Baal, he says, if Baal is anything at all, if he is any type of a God, he can contend with him himself. And he stood up for his son, even though it had cost him his own altar, it had cost him his own Asherah pole, it had cost him at least one, maybe two bulls, but he stood up for his son. And he stopped them from slaying his son because of what he had done. You might remember the guy's name better by Gideon, was the young man who did this. Okay, there's another story of a father. And this father had children by many wives. Not uncommon in that day, kind of crazy in my way of thinking, but at any rate, he had several children and several different wives. There was one of his children by the name of Amnon, I believe it was, who fell in love madly, deeply, just overwhelmingly in love with his half-sister, Tamar. And that's all he thought about. That's all he consumed all of his day with, and he just couldn't figure out what to do about it. And so he plotted, with some help of another brother, of how to get her to himself. And so what he did was he pretended to be sick, and he had asked for Tamar to come and take care of him and wait on him and fix him food. And she did. But while she was there, then he sent everybody else out, and to make a long story short, he violated her. He took her under protest, and he violated her. At that point, the love that he had for her that was so intense turned to a hatred that was just as intense as the love once was. Here she was embarrassed and ashamed and downcast because of what had happened to her. And he had just a hatred for her now, the woman that he once had such great love for. The king, the father, heard of this and was displeased, but there's no record of him doing anything about it. But Tamar had a brother, full brother, by the name of Absalom. And Absalom sought revenge. He was cunning enough that he knew that anything that he would do right away would be found out, so he waited. 2 years passed, and he invited all of his brothers and all of his family and everything, all of his brothers and everything, to a sheep shearing, and at that point, they got Amnon drunk, and whenever they had him pretty well soused, they slew him. And Absalom, then knowing that what he had done was going to get him in trouble, he fled and went to another country. Same dad, same king, heard of it, was displeased, saddened, again, did nothing. Nothing in the Bible is recording of what he did. After he had been in his own personal exile for 3 years, the king finally says, have him come back. And Absalom was returned to Jerusalem, but the king, the father, never reunited with his son. Never made contact with him, never went and saw him, never addressed anything that had happened, just wanted him back in the country, but then he had nothing to do. Can you imagine who that king might be? You know him, King David. Now, this crazy part about this is here we have a father who did not worship God, but worshiped a pagan god, Baal, who, when push come to shove, stood up for his son, and he says, over my dead body, will you touch my son? And then we have a man who is known in the Bible as being a man after God's own heart, who stood by instead of standing up for his children. Now, I can give it the idea that probably Joash had more of a hands-on experience with his son because he was not a king over a mighty nation than maybe David was. But at the same time, David still had children. And as great as he was in running a country, as great as he was in fighting a war, as great as he was in so many other things, even in his own personal life, he was not really what you'd call a role model when it come to being a dad. Now, whenever we're talking about Father's Day today, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to be a father. But it takes a man to be a good dad. And that's what I kind of want to look at today. Sometimes they come from some of the most unusual backgrounds and sources. The hardest part of being a dad, and I want to read out of Ephesians chapter 6, 10 through 13, and I know this is not just applying to dads, but since it's Father's Day, I want to talk about this. Verse 10. This is Paul's final address to the church in Ephesus. And he is talking to the families. And he says, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God that you may be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the full armor of God, that you may be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything, to stand firm. Anybody who has ever raised a teenager and has ever had a conflict with a teenager, if you stand back and you look at it from a different perspective, you realize that the argument that you have with your teenager is not really with the child itself, but it's with what's going on in and around that child's life. You know, we struggle so hard in this world to keep up with the Joneses that we lose sight of where the Joneses are even going. We compromise what we know to be true and what we believe in our hearts because it fits in with what everybody else is doing. Look at the last couple of generations in our society and the changes that have been made. And I just want to look at just a couple. One of them that gets me and will get me to turn off a movie faster than anything else is the language. You'll turn on a movie and you think, it's got a great plot. You know, it sounds like a really good. And you can't get, 2 minutes into it until the language just makes you want to shut it off. Why is that language there? It's because it has become socially acceptable. Now then, are we better off today because we have the freedom of expression in that form? I don't think so. It just maybe it appeals to some people, but to the other people it just really turns them off. We have no concern for what the other person might think. We're socializing based on the few instead of the populace. Yesterday I had on my new John Wayne shirt that, I'm still a John Wayne fan. He still has, I tell Sherry, it's a new movie. John Wayne's in it. I can watch this one. It's not a rerun. It's a new one. And, whenever you watch one of those today, you realize that there was a lot more going on than just the plot. There was a goodness, where the good guy wins. The bad guy always loses. It was the respect that you give somebody else that deserves respect, and the way you do not tolerate someone who just violates that. By the way, my shirt said, "Life is tough, but it's tougher if you're stupid." I saw that I had to get it. Wear it proudly. Our society is more geared with what everybody's trying to keep up with than what's right. We're all guilty of it. Every one of us. In an effort to try and be more correct, just in our own country, we have become so anti-social to anybody who disagrees with our political views or our thought process. And the hatred that is spewed because I don't agree with the way you voted or the way you think or the way I voted or the way I think, And so, is that making us a freer person? No. Most of the discussions that I had with my kids growing up was not because they were bad, but it usually dealt with what everybody else was doing and how they were getting to do this and how, I wasn't allowing it in my family. Let me tell you a little bit about my dad. I was raised not in a Christian home, but I was raised with, and I counted them up yesterday, out of the 10 Commandments, we were raised under 7 of the 10. Now then, the ones that we really struggled on was, the first one was, and this was kind of not really sure where we stood on it. We believed that there was one God, just one God. But we didn't believe it enough to serve him. So, just how do you fit that in? The second one was, shall not have any vain idols. We passed that one. We did pretty good on that one. The ones that we struggled with the most, especially was, "You shall not take the Lord's name in vain." I mean, that was a daily, almost hourly breaking of that one. That was just, didn't ever stand a chance. And the other one was the weekly, "Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy." I used to think, we always cut brush on Sunday. Every stinking Sunday. We had to go cut trees down. Dad run chainsaw, and us 4 boys, or whoever was left at home, had to pile the brush. And I always blamed Dad for working harder on Sunday because he felt guilty for working at all. Didn't work, but that's what I always blamed him for. But the rest of the commandments, you don't steal, you don't lie, you don't commit adultery, you don't, covet, you don't do any of this stuff, you don't murder. Those were givens. He still lived by a strict moral code. And even though he was not raising us in a Christian home. But what Dad did was whatever he did it with everything he had. And he believed in it. And he was not flexible at all. As my kids have accused me of inheriting, he was bullheaded. Very bullheaded. And I can remember arguments with my kids, and they would just throw up their hands and say, "You'll never change. You're the most bullheaded person I ever heard of. I ever known." I said, "Thank you." They didn't add to the conversation very well, but, it was the truth. Now, the good news in this for my dad was that once he accepted Christ, he went at it with the same vigor that he went at everything else. He didn't just go on Sundays and then forget the rest of the week. He was at church every time the doors were open. If something was going on in the church, he was involved in it. Every time. I mean, he sold out completely. I got to my dad sold feed for Mormons, and then I took his territory whenever he retired because I also sold. And the one thing that a lot of his longtime customers told me was, he says, "I didn't always agree with your dad, but I always respected him because he told you exactly what he thought, and he always believed it to be the truth. He always told you the truth. He never changed, and he always told you what he believed was the best advice he could give." And so they had a great respect for him because of that. Now, as I think about, what Paul is writing here, he is saying, we a lot of times look at the situation that maybe our kids or somebody else is going through, and we blame it all on that individual. And Paul says, we're not struggling with that person. We're struggling with the philosophies that are being accepted. We're struggling with the ideas that are being pushed on to our children. We're struggling with the immorality that the devil is just scheming all the time to try and throw at us and just get us to buy into. Oh, a little bit won't hurt, until we have a disaster on our hands. There's a passage of scripture that I'm sure is being used in most churches today, and it is the next one, Bailey. You guys all know this one. "Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it." Train up a child in the way he will go. Does that guarantee that he'll always stay in church? Does it guarantee that he'll always stay and toe the line? I mentioned Joash had a son named Gideon, and Joash served Baal. I mentioned King David, who served God and did nothing when one of his sons raped his sister, or when another son killed his brother. Never did anything about it. Think of the story of the prodigal son for just a minute. You know this story, but I want you to think of it from a different perspective. How could one man raise 2 kids to be so different? One says, "Give me my share of the inheritance, and I'll go make my own decisions." The other one says, I'm going to stay right here and I'm just going to keep building this farm. I'm just going to keep building my inheritance. And I'm going to be selfish with it. Same dad, same environment, raised two kids to be so completely different. Now then, here's my thought process on this. Why did that happen? Why is it that we have some dads that just do a terrible job and raise wonderful kids come out of it, and we have wonderful parents, and there's one kid, or sometimes more, that just goes haywire? It's because God created each one of us with an individual spirit. He created us individually. Now, if you know somebody who says, I don't believe in God, I want you to give them this theory. And it is what I call the McDonald's French fry. I shared it with Chelsea this morning. If there was no God, we would all be like McDonald's French fries. Have you ever if you go over to McDonald's at Bethany and get their French fries, and then you go to Kansas City and stop at McDonald's and get their French fries, or you go to Florida and stop at McDonald's and get their French fries, aren't they all the same? Do you know why? Because they use the same ingredients and the same recipe every single time, so that no matter whether you buy them in Bethany or in Florida or in Arizona or in California, they're all going to be the same. If there was no God and you used the same recipe, wouldn't all of our children be identical twins except for their age? You're using the exact same recipe, the exact same ingredients. You should get the exact same result. But God chose us different. He wants each one of us to be individuals. He wants each one of us to have our own thought process, our own decision-making ability, because He's not interested in having a bunch of robots running around, but He is looking for a group of people who will come to realize who He is and choose Him as their God and serve Him with love and desire. Everybody does it. If they did, we'd be building on. Now then, what does being a good father guarantee that your kids are always going to be great, upstanding citizens and always serve the Lord? No. No guarantees. But I mentioned this morning in the children's moment. For example, kids today, and I probably have grandkids that are involved in this, that are not in church today because they're playing basketball someplace. Do you realize that in just the United States alone, there are probably thousands of basketball games and tournaments being played in our country today, with tens of thousands of kids involved? Out of those tens of thousands of kids, how many will make it into a career? How many will even get their way through college paid? You know, the percentage, probably pretty small. But if they never played at all, what does that do to the numbers? What is your chances if you play every day getting into a professional sport if you play every day? But then what does that compare to if you never play? If we don't expose our children to God, where are they going to know where to turn when that individual part of them says, I need something more? I need a new direction. I need something to satisfy because this just isn't working. And I know very few adults that at some point in their life, whether they was raised in church or whether they weren't, that haven't come to that point in their life where they just finally say, I need something more than what I've got. And a lot of times it just involves a commitment to something. For my life, it was commitment to Christ. Quit playing with Christianity and start actually becoming a Christian. I mentioned that my dad never went to church or never took us to church. Do you know why? Because of the people that he saw and visited with and dealt with every day that went to church on Sundays, but you couldn't tell them apart on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. That's why he didn't go. He confessed to me one day that whenever he was in the service, there was one man that he was in the service with that he said if there was ever a true Christian, it was him. But all of the ones that pretended or were just faulty or just, whatever, because he was an all-in type of a guy, he couldn't take half-heartedness. Now, I believe that God will take you wherever you're at. The good news about Joash, the good news about King David, before their life was over with, they turned back to God. Joash realized who God really was, and it wasn't Baal. King David realized that he had made some mistakes, some serious mistakes with his kids, and he prayed and sought forgiveness. The good news is that if you can still hear and still read God's word, then there's still hope. In our world today, there are a lot of deadbeat moms and dads, but it's not too late. Still return back to God. Make use of what time is left. I pray that everybody here has had just a wonderful dad. And I know that if you're like me, I loved my dad. I respected my dad. I miss my dad. But there were still times that we had some pretty heated arguments. Mainly because he raised me to be independent. He raised me to be bullheaded, and then we clashed. But that clashing grew to respect as time went on. God is our perfect example of what a good father is. None of us can measure up to that, but just like Jesus showing us the perfect example, he doesn't expect us to be perfect, but I think he wants us to at least try. You hear the commercials on TV, you don't have to be a perfect dad to be a dad. Boy, if that don't hit home. I'm not very good at those corny jokes yet, but just to have the heart to want to raise your kids in the right way so that as they get older, knowing that they're going to make their own decisions, that they're going to choose God. And to me, that's what Father's Day is all about. So as we've gathered here this morning, thank God, first, that he is the perfect example. Thank God for the good dads that you've had in your life. And just pray for all of our young fathers that are raising their children today to just walk in the ways that God would have them to walk. And help each and every one of us to see that whenever we stumble, we fall, we make our mistakes, that our Heavenly Father is waiting, just like the father of the prodigal son, waiting out on the porch, looking down the road, waiting for us to come back, so that he might welcome us. My son who was dead is now alive. We must rejoice. This morning, as we stand to sing the hymn of invitation, if God is speaking to your heart about any decision that you need to make, I pray that as the song is sang, that you'll minister according to what God has spoken to your heart. I have decided